Welcome to a discussion about how to end homelessness in Canada. I'm Terry Seguin. I think we can agree that homelessness and finding affordable housing for citizens is one of Canada's top social issues, certainly one of the top three. And the reason we're having this discussion is because a good friend of mine, James Hughes, has produced a book with 12 other social policy experts with the mission of how do we end homelessness in Canada. And so Jim, who used to be the former deputy minister of social development in New Brunswick, and who is now the current president and CEO of the Old Brewery Mission in Montreal, got in touch with me and said, look, we've produced this book. I think it's a good roadmap, a good strategy for ending homelessness in Canada. Would you have some time to talk to me about it? And so I got in touch with Jeff Dupre here at Rogers and said, Jeff, is your studio available for a discussion about what I think is a really important issue in this country? And Jeff went up the line and came back with a yes. And so here we are today. James Hughes, welcome.
Thank you very much, Terry. Thank you so much for having me and getting this organized.
Yeah, it's. I think you would agree. It's a critically important issue to the country, to Canadians. How did this book come about? When did the moment strike you that we need to have a book that describes how to end homelessness?
So before the book was, of course, a feeling. Really, this comes from a profound frustration with the increase in homelessness that we're seeing across the country. So I'm from Montreal, as you know, but spent a lot of time here in New Brunswick. And what the two places have in common, and what they have in common with the rest of the country, is that we are witnessing historic increases in homelessness that we've never seen before, mostly because of COVID.
How does COVID play into it?
So COVID has changed everything. COVID has been an absolutely terrible reality for our society in general, and there I'm not just talking about Canada, the United States, Europe, everywhere else, because it has in part been the instigator for the increase in housing prices and rents at a rate that we haven't seen before. We'll talk about this more, but the homelessness crisis we're seeing is really caused by a housing crisis. More people coming in than ever before, and less opportunities to help people out of homelessness than ever before. So this is what really is the feeling of that we have to do more than we've done in the past in terms of restricting ourselves to just treating homelessness. So I work for this big organization in Montreal. We're an organization that's very sophisticated. We're not the only one working in the area. But what we do, and what we've done for over 100 years, the Old Brewery was founded in 1889 during the social gospel. What we've done is we've waited for people to become homeless and then wrap them in services to try to help them on the journey out, hopefully in a permanent way. But despite the fact that we have gotten better and better at that we've become housing developers. We own or manage over 400 units of housing in Montreal.
So you are actually creating, buying, and refurbishing, creating the housing?
Yes, we are. We're doing that, and we're not the only ones doing that. But just because the only way to solve homelessness is through housing, and that the private sector really, and somewhat understandably, is not necessarily good at trying to find solutions for the kinds of people we deal with who can pay $300 a month, no more, who have sometimes a basket of medical issues, behavioral issues that are difficult to take. They prefer to maybe take someone else. And in a housing crisis, when there's less and less affordable housing, and they have their landlords more and more choice on who to take, our guys and gals get left on the sidelines. So really what this book is about is saying, that homelessness is going up despite the fact that organizations like ours and governments, including the government here, are providing more services, more resources than ever before. We're going in the wrong direction.
But if you wanted to trace the current problem back to its roots, where do you have to go?
So the roots of big homelessness, this is what we're living today, big homelessness. As I said, Oldbury's been around for a long time, but we have never seen the numbers we're seeing today. And I'll give you an example. In 1993, the Oldbury Mission managed one building, and it was just for men, and there was 150 spaces. Fast forward 10 years, we managed 450 beds of a shelter kind, so emergency shelter beds, 450 of those including for women. So in the space of 10 years, we tripled in size. The Calgary Drop-In Center went from a couple of hundred beds and cots to over 1,000 in the same space of time. So just in terms of big homelessness, we went from little homelessness to big homelessness in that era of austerity that we all may remember from the 1990s. That is still causing problems today. And then we started having to change the way we worked in the sector and not just be a witness to despair, but try to solve homelessness. Like the movement to start to solve homelessness started in the early 2000s. Claudette Bradshaw for here in New Brunswick was one of the leaders of that whole expedition as the first minister responsible for trying to fight homelessness in Canada. But it was a self-inflicted wound. It happened because of government policies, cutting welfare, cutting transfer payments, deinstitutionalization of mental health care that has had this huge effect. And what we haven't also talked about is which preceded this problem by over 100 years, which is colonialist, racist practices as regards Indigenous people and the removal of lands and residential schools, which has also produced levels of Indigenous homelessness that we've never seen before either. So we've got a lot of history that is sitting on our shoulders that we have to accept and come to terms with. But ultimately, it can't stop us from acting. And this book is about what to do.
Okay, so back in that 10-year period when those numbers started to increase noticeably, were governments cognizant of the consequence of the austerity policies that they were implementing? Like, were they monitoring how is society reacting to this austerity?
I would say perhaps marginally, but certainly not enough. That's a 10-year period. That's enough time to see the arc going up. And who was funding the increase in the shelter spaces? It was government. So they certainly knew it was happening. There's no question about that. But I don't think anybody was worried that doing anything differently was particularly important. It was only when it got really big, as I say, big pharma, big oil, big homelessness, was when everyone said, "Okay, we've got to change directions."
Okay, and so looking at where we are today, what are the elements that have made this the crisis it is today?
Well, we were sort of getting it under control to some degree through the teens, through that 2010 to 2020 period. The street counts. So the science of homelessness, like how do you know how big it is we largely through what we call street counts or point in time counts, pit counts. That's where you send out volunteers mostly into the streets and into the shelters, and actually on one night or one day, you count the number of people that are homeless.
Like, how accurate is that?
It's pretty good. It's those are minimum numbers. You don't find everybody. But it gives you not only the numbers, it gives you some qualitative information as well. So it's a very valuable tool.
It's the best method we have.
It's the best method we have. There's other ways that are more sophisticated. Some places do it. It's called coordinated access, where on a daily basis, you're gathering all these statistics and then projecting them. City of Toronto is particularly good at that, but most places are not. So the street counts, as I say, are a good and valuable way to get a sense of the size of it. The Montreal numbers are the following. So in 2015, we had about 3,000 people on any given night, minimum, who were homeless. In the 2018 count, it had only gone up to like 3,100, 3,200. So it was pretty flat. It was ticking up a little bit, but cause for some optimism. Like it's looking pretty good. The 2022 count showed there was 4,700 people. So it had gone up 30% in 4 years.
So what triggered that?
COVID. This is what we were talking about before. This is all about housing. It's almost becoming a form of economic homelessness, because the number one reason, according to those street counts, for people becoming homeless was now private sector housing evictions. So people getting evicted or not having access to housing because it was unaffordable, or they had no other option to go when there was a rent eviction or a dem eviction, or a personal use exception that was used. So all of these mostly legal methods that private landlords were doing to try to take advantage of a market where rents could be jacked up because people were willing to pay them. That's the market at work.
Was that a pervasive ideology within the rental industry? Like, let's maximize profit now, this is an opportunity?
It always has been, to some degree. But it's been particularly obvious now because of the consequences. This is what COVID, we've talked about COVID revealing underlying trends. Well, COVID has revealed that housing is not a right in Canada. Otherwise, homelessness would not be going up at the rate it is. So we have a huge problem when it comes to the preserving of affordable housing in this country, here in Fredericton and elsewhere across this province as well. We have it in Quebec and Montreal. And if we don't take it on, we're going to see this trend going up even further. So just to give you a stat, over the last 10 years, we've lost across Canada 380,000 units of housing that's affordable, that's deemed affordable.
Okay, lost in the marketplace.
In the marketplace, in the private sector marketplace. And that's 10 times more than the new units that we've added that are affordable. So it's a 10-to-1 loss. So are we in a housing crisis? We are in a housing crisis because, as I say, so many units have been pulled off the market and become unaffordable. So these are, for instance, REITs, which are buying property, renovating.
Real estate investment trusts.
Correct, who are, and then take an $800 rent and now make it $1,800. And it's the kind of thing that, where does that person then go? And most people can figure it out. You know, they'll move, they'll leave, but at the end of the day, there's enough people that have nowhere else to go that they're finding themselves at the Fredericton shelter. And that's the problem we're facing.
Okay, so how do you deal then with the rental industry doing rent evictions, telling people, no, we don't want you here? Is that a regulatory solution?
There's lots of different tools that communities and governments have used to try to start to take that on. The first one that most people have used is actually trying to increase supply. So saying, okay, we accept the rules of the game. Those are the rules. Those are legitimate and legal methods that private landlords are doing. But so let's just build as much as we can. But we haven't. That hasn't worked by itself.
Why not?
Well, we haven't seen governments actually invest enough in housing. As I said, tonight there'll be 5,000 people who are homeless in Montreal, and the provincial government last year announced 500 new units of housing for homeless people. So the magnitude is not high enough. And this is, I'm not saying this is not big money. This is big money, but it's big money not to invest as well, because it doesn't cost nothing for someone to be homeless. It's actually quite expensive. Claudette Bradshaw, we mentioned before, was part of a study back in 2015 called At Home Chez Soi, which calculated what is the cost of services for people who are chronically homeless. And in today's numbers, that's about $70,000 per year per person in hospital services, in ambulance services, in judicial services, and so on. So that's real money that would be saved if we actually made it a priority to end homelessness, if we could.
Okay, so who has the responsibility? Where does the responsibility lie in our society for us to do what is required to resolve the crisis?
Yeah. So
big question.
Big question. Yeah. What do we do? So for sure, upstream prevention initiatives are the way to go. So that's what this book is about, which has just come out and is, I think, a really interesting contribution. I like to think, I'm actually passionate about the fact that we're trying to articulate some strategies to try to end homelessness by it never happening in the first place. It's the best way to reduce homelessness is to turn off the taps of where homelessness is being generated. And evictions is one issue. And you take that on through a whole complex set of regulatory tools, including, for instance, providing rent banks for people who need an extra month's rent. And I know there's a rent bank here, which is really interesting. Don't know all the details about it.
How does it work? Do you know?
So rent bank. Okay, I can't make rent this month, or I can't make part of my rent this month. They turn to the rent bank, which is sometimes managed by a nonprofit or sometimes by a government agency, and say, can you give me a grant or a loan or a combination so I can get through this month? How cheap is that? Here's whatever. Here's $1,000. And now we've reduced the likelihood of that someone becoming homeless and God forbid becoming chronically homeless with the costs I just mentioned.
What if they come to you next month and say, I can't make it this month either?
Right. So I got to put rules around this so it doesn't become something that you see every month. But what you can do is if the problem persists, you can make sure that person has additional services. Including financial literacy and in some cases mental health services, whatever the person needs. When someone puts their hand up and says, I'm in trouble, that's an opportunity for us to actually now identify what the problem is, create a relationship, and try to prevent whatever that problem is that person is facing from being increased or magnified because they've been left alone. Anyway, we can get into that. But rent banks are one way. During COVID, we saw in the States, eviction moratoriums. You can't evict anybody because the consequences were too high for someone to be evicted, become homeless with all the public health dangers.
How effective was that?
Very effective. It was incredibly effective. You had much lower rates of homelessness because that segment of the population was being protected. But when COVID ended, those moratoriums were slowly taken off, and all of a sudden, now many of those people are subject to evictions again.
But in that case, you're asking the landlords to be part of the social safety net, even if they don't want to. You're
Precisely.
Forcing them.
Yeah, it's a tricky business. I mean, is that something we should thrust upon them? I mean, eviction moratoriums have never been used before or after, because of exactly that reason, and perhaps understandably. So what are the other tools you would use? Another one in New York City that's used is obligatory mediation between landlord and tenant if there's a threat of eviction for someone who is at risk of homelessness. So if you're at risk of homelessness, we're going to try to buy some time so that we can either mediate you back into the place you're at, maybe you get a rent bank loan, we figure something out, or we find you another place so that we don't see you on the street.
How do landlords react to that? You could understand them being reluctant to rent a property to someone who they think might be headed toward that situation where they're forced to keep providing them with shelter, even if the person can't pay or chronically can't pay.
Yeah, I mean, we have to, if we're serious about reducing homelessness, we have to take on the issue of evictions. We have to do it. In Toronto, we're seeing tenant strikes that are starting. That tenants are actually striking. They're not paying the increases in rent that are being imposed upon them. And they're doing something about it collectively. Just like 100 years ago, the unions of employees started to say, no, this is not right. We know from in Finland, they have large tenant unions that actually negotiate with large collectives of landlords to agree upon an annual increase in rents. A totally different system, but if we're seeing like across the country, the average increase in rent over the last year, or in 2023, last year, was in the 8% area. That's for units that were occupied. But the average increase for units that were unoccupied.
Like newly constructed?
No, like so someone has been evicted, or someone has been invited to leave because renovations were going on. So it was actually unoccupied, the unit. The increase is average increase was 18% for those. So, that's the housing market that we have today. And as I say, most people are figuring it out. They'll move to a region, or they'll combine forces with somebody else to be able to pay a rent. But there's this edge of the population that's alone, fragile, sometimes ill, very few social networks to help them, no options, and they get evicted. What do? They come to the Oldbury Mission. Mm. And that's what we have to avoid.
So it's a supply and demand situation. In the example you just gave of the unoccupied rent going up 18%, if my rudimentary understanding of economics, if the demand increases and the supply isn't there, then the cost of the product increases.
Precisely. In the past, you see people move every year, every other year, kind of naturally. People at lower levels of income, generally speaking now, are super scared of losing their apartment because there's so few other options. They're clinging on to it as much as they can. And as I say, in Toronto and a couple of places, they're locking arms with their neighbors and saying, you can't increase, I'm on a fixed income. You cannot increase that more than my fixed income is being increased because I'm hooped otherwise.
So does rent control work? Is that a practical solution?
Well, rent control is absolutely crucial, and in Montreal we do have it. In many places they don't. But those numbers I was talking about in terms of increases are going up despite rent control, right? So these are the landlord class, and I don't want to cast aspersions on all landlords, by the way. We work with landlords at the Oldbury, where those are hugely important relationships to us, and we are so blessed to have, in many cases, generous, patient, welcoming landlords. And so I want to make sure I say that publicly. But there's enough landlords whose motive, understandably, is profit, that they would rather invite someone to leave, renovate, and then try to get someone else in at a much higher rent than try to preserve the relationship with the original person.
It's easier.
It's easier, and there's more money in their pocket. And as I say, it's human.
So what is our economy, what is the gig economy contributing to this issue? Young people in their late teens, early 20s, early 30s who are working a couple of jobs at probably a little bit above minimum wage, but certainly not enough to provide you with an income where you could afford a nice apartment. What is our economy doing to contribute to the problem?
Yeah, the crisis is affects the people who are finding themselves on the edge and at risk of homelessness, but they're not the only ones. I mean, my kids are in their 20s, and they've basically written off the idea of any time soon becoming an owner. Like, forget about it. And we hear this all over, right? I mean, the costs of housing have gone up so much faster than the costs of or the income people are generating. Really, we're talking about an income gap or a money gap, a revenue gap. Housing prices, income, whether it be as an employee or a member of the gig economy, they've not gone up at the same rate. One has gone up way faster than the other.
18%. When's the last time anybody's wages went up 18%?
Well, precisely. There you go. So it's no wonder we're seeing frustration and in some cases, just acceptance of an economy that you and I didn't grow up in. This is a brand new economy, and
Where did
Yeah.
you're not an economist, but you know the issue. So where did that new economy come from? I mean, we just transitioned, or was there some ideology at work that said, okay, look, the economy is going to develop this way, and we know there are going to be victims, more and more victims, but we're good with that.
Yeah. Well, how did that happen? And you're right. I'm not an economist, but I do know that there's a lot of suffering out there. But I'm also, I've got either the blessing or the curse of optimism, and what that means. What is an optimist? I think an optimist is someone who always believes that the best is ahead. And so I think we're potentially at a cusp where we see some good things coming.
Where is this in the public's mind? And we did an event yesterday where I asked whether we had the social license to divert government funding to tackling this social issue. Where do you think the average Canadian who may not be affected by the harsh reality of the income gap, where do you think how do they feel about this issue?
I think the housing crisis in particular, but the homelessness that is increasing as a result, is now become a top 5 issue. I think the housing may be the number 1 issue in this country, and it's an election issue for sure. So is it important? I think absolutely. And homelessness is in every community now, right? So what has happened because of COVID in part is that we're seeing not just more homelessness, as we talked about, but increasing diversity of homelessness. And what I mean by that is we're seeing more people who would be of a complex profile, more use of opioids, more combinations of mental illness and addiction. 75% of people who are experiencing homelessness have either a mental illness, an addiction, or both. That's kind of a rough statistic. It changed a little bit, men, women, but it's a big number. It's a big majority.
That's a cause and effect relationship?
It's got cause and effect. It helps increase someone's risk of homelessness, but it also increases the risk that they stay in homelessness for longer periods of time. But then the other vector is that homelessness is almost in every community right now. I mean, it used to be, in Quebec, it used to be really Montreal.
Right.
But the new street counts are showing that it's in Three Rivers, it's in Sherbrooke, it's in Gatineau, it's everywhere. And mayors of these cities are starting to go, what's going on here? And so so when I talk about optimism, there's new allies, there's new eyes on this, there's new levels of importance that are being put to this. When I was here back in 2008 to 2011, we created through the Graham government created a poverty reduction agency called ESIC, the Economic and Social Inclusion Corporation, which is really all about trying to figure out what to do in the poverty area across the province. It's in its 4th plan right now, and someone from ESIC, the wonderful Stéphane Leclerc, was with us last night, and he told us that in the surveys they're now doing to try to get a sense of what New Brunswickers think about this issue, 1 in 2 people has said housing and homelessness are the priority that this province should pay attention to.
Because they're seeing it on the street.
Because they're seeing it. They're seeing it in their communities. And it's not just in Fredericton, St. John, and Moncton. It's in the north. It's in Bathurst. It's in Miramichi. It's in Edmundston. It's everywhere now. And the numbers are huge, and that's really good. So this province has the opportunity to pick this issue off. The worst aspects of the housing crisis, as they say, manifesting in homelessness before it gets any bigger, and that would be a wonderful example for the rest of the country.
Okay, so we have 3 levels of government: federal, provincial, municipal. What responsibilities does each of those government levels have in dealing with the issue?
Okay, let me try to simplify that as much as I can. So the federal government really has two big responsibilities in this. I think it has others, but if you're asking me for one, maybe two, here's what I think. The first is, and it just made an announcement in this regard, is it's got to supply the capital. It's got to supply the big money. The big money is at the federal government level. And it's got to supply the money to preserve existing affordable housing and create new affordable housing. It just announced, I think hats off to the federal government, it just announced something called the Canada Acquisition Fund. And that's going to hopefully fund through grants and loans the ability of nonprofit organizations like the Old Brewery, like the Fredericton Shelters here, to acquire existing affordable housing so that ownership transfers from private to nonprofit, thereby ensuring that the people who are in those buildings are never at risk of homelessness. Right? We talked about renovation. So those risks are gone. If we renovate, we'll find places for other people. So
Right.
The big capital has got to come from the federal government. There are other huge responsibilities for Indigenous people in Canada. Like they have the primary responsibility there.
And are the numbers similar in Indigenous communities? In the homelessness numbers?
No, it's disproportionately high. In some cases, the homeless populations, like in Winnipeg, Edmonton, some of the other big centers, it's up to 40-50% of people experiencing homelessness are Indigenous, and special attention has to be paid to Indigenous-led solutions that include the transfer of land claims. It's got to be about land and the control of the land to build culturally appropriate housing for Indigenous people.
So the resources would provide the wealth required to resolve that 40 to 50% homelessness numbers on Indigenous communities.
Yeah, well, to provide opportunities to build the kind of housing that maybe draw Indigenous people back to their communities. I mean, there's 40% of Indigenous people live in communities now, and 60% off reserve, what we call off reserve. And that's in part because of a housing crisis on reserve. There's not enough housing there that's adequate. Overpopulation, overusage of dwellings on reserve is appalling. So it's no wonder people are leaving. So it's not the only reason, but the federal government's got to pay particular attention to that aspect of the housing crisis that we're experiencing in the country.
So the provincial governments, and here's the current example is Doug Ford saying to the federal government, your housing accelerator fund, we're not comfortable with the idea that you're going to be controlling zoning at a municipal level. How do you resolve a federal government that recognizes the problem, has initiatives to deal with it, but meeting resistance at the provincial level and in some cases at the municipal level?
Yeah, age-old Fed-Prov issues, right? But we've worked those out in the past. I mean, I'm, again, maybe overly optimistic, but I used to sit in the NB housing chair here, and we figured things out. Making common cause with the federal government is in terms of ensuring capital dollars flow into projects that target these types of vulnerable populations is something Liberals, Conservatives, NDP they all agree on. That's how you do it. The mechanics could be different province to province, but I think we can get at that. But can we talk about the province just for a second,
Yeah,
and
please
provincial
do.
responsibilities?
Yeah, for sure.
Because I have a bee in my bonnet about it.
Let's hear it.
So provincial governments have specific responsibilities for a number of areas. Child protection. They have responsibilities for, obviously, provincial prisons, health services. I'll just name those three to start. In terms of the street counts, and when we go out and ask people why they're homeless, I mentioned evictions, but we also know that people coming out of child protection, 1 in 2 young people on the street in Montreal in shelters or on the street has come from foster care or child protection. 1 and 2, 50%. I've got to pause on that, just thinking about, so child protection services are generating homelessness. Now most kids coming out of care.
Hold on, child protection services are generating homelessness.
Yes. Now to hold that thought, provincial prisons are also generating homelessness. 1 in 5, in some places 1 in 4 people coming out of prisons is being released to the street. People coming out of mental health care, people coming out of hospitals. These are places where most people who are discharged, a great majority, are not being discharged into homelessness. But those coming out of government's care are enough of the population that we're seeing it in the street counts. So what can governments do? What governments can do is say, I've got to do better. Right now, I'm actually doing a pretty good job. Most people, as I say, in my care are not being released to homelessness, but I got to go a little farther because some of them are particularly vulnerable. So first, what I got to do, I've got to assess for homelessness risk. And we can do that now. We have some surveys to assess for homelessness risk. Have you been homeless before? Where are you going tonight? It's actually quite easy and quite efficient to determine before discharge, or in the case of prison population, even when you're entering the prison population, what your risk of homelessness is. Number one. Number two, now I use my best efforts to do for those people what I'm successfully doing for most other people, and ensuring that when you are released, you're not going to the Fredericton shelter. So we're talking about homelessness prevention here, child protection as well. Like it is absolutely essential, that, and I'm talking about Quebec too. I'm not pointing my fingers at any particular province. I used to be responsible here for child protection services as the Deputy of Social Development. We also have to start to add this assessment because we cannot release young people from our care who possibly will find themselves living in Odell Park. Like it's inconceivable that we do that. So just to wrap it all together, what I've proposed in the book, and we don't have here, but we have some European examples of this, is something I call the Homelessness Prevention Act. So it's a piece of legislation that would impose is a big word, but it would create a framework within which government departments, such as the ones I'm mentioning, would have the responsibility to assess for homelessness risk, 1. 2, would intervene with best efforts to try to ensure that that person is not released to homelessness, and 3, reports annually on their success in that regard. By doing that, by being more transparent about how we manage these public institutions, I think that could have a beautiful and dramatically positive effect on the number of people coming into homelessness, and really see it improve so that we need less treatment. We've actually succeeded in going upstream and preventing it in the first place.
But isn't a critical component of that strategy adequate support services for those people who are being released into society? You can do your assessment, but if the personnel aren't there to provide the support when it's necessary, how do we expect people to actually thrive if they don't have the supports available because of fiscal restraints? People, they don't have enough personnel in the province to handle the job.
Yeah, this is a terrific question, but once you've assessed for the risk and you have a sense of the magnitude of it, now you absolutely have to react and add resources. But whether you add resources there or add resources at treatment once people are homeless, you got to do it anyway. It's not like you can't do it. And if we continue to see homelessness going up and up and up, in the way it has in Fredericton, the numbers. Apologies if I've already mentioned this, but 2016 to 2023, 400% increase in homelessness.
400%
in our province here in New Brunswick. 400% increase over that period of time. It's been dramatic. So pre-COVID to post-COVID, it's a new ball game, especially in Moncton. That's where half of the homeless people are is in the city of Moncton.
And safe to assume that those people who don't have the means to pay for a place to stay are also struggling with food. I mean, if you don't, I mean, do you even have the money to buy groceries or vegetables?
Right. It's the same. The price increases have mirrored housing price increases, and has welfare income. Most people who are living in homelessness are on welfare incomes. Have welfare incomes gone up 18%? I assure you, they haven't. They haven't here. They haven't anywhere. So, right, and that's further responsibility on the part of the province to think about that, because welfare income can't pay a rent. Welfare income and a rent supplement and a housing allowance can pay a rent. But that's the kind of public policy that we have to weave into this tapestry.
How are we defining affordable housing?
Affordable housing is defined by CMHC. Usually affordable means 80% of the market rent in a given locale, and that will be different from one locale to another. But 80% of a market rent, in Montreal, the average rent for one bedroom is $1,500. So 80% of that, what's that going to be? $1,200, something like that. That's something our guys can't afford. As I say, in welfare income in Montreal for a single unattached person is about $700, $710. Like, how do you do that? You do that with a rent supplement. So government's paying the top up to make sure that person gets into a unit that they can pay for, but the unit itself is not always affordable.
So in Montreal, I know the mayor and council said to developers, if you want permission to build an apartment complex, we would like you, as your contribution to fighting homelessness, to dedicate, I don't know, 10% of your units in your building as affordable housing. Do you see any value in a policy like that in a place like New Brunswick?
Well, okay, so the policy, the objectives of the policy are moral, the objectives of the policy are laudable, but the policy didn't work. They called it 20-20-20, so it's supposed to be 20% social housing, 20% family, 20% for seniors, I think was the model. And developers were not happy with the model, and so we haven't seen units being built. We've seen a lot of developers pay the fine, because you have an alternative. You can actually pay into a fund, but it's not, the fund is not large enough to actually get you to the 10% of the units of any given development that you might have. So the right economic move for the developers was actually just to pay the price, and so it has not been outstanding. But as I say, the goal is laudable, and we have to think about how municipalities can do their share, and that's one way of trying to do it. But there's others, and the Plante administration has done fabulous work on another kind of way of going about attacking the question, which is by using the power of their legal power to put a lien or a right of first refusal on an affordable housing complex, right, say a rooming house. So they put that legal lien on, it's actually on title, and then when that building comes up for sale, they get the first right to buy it. And they've done that successfully in a number of cases and thereby preserving affordable units that might otherwise go to someone who would, pull a rent eviction or a demoviction process and make those affordable units unaffordable.
Turn them into high-end apartments.
Right.
Instead of apartments that are accessible by people.
So that's a city government that did that, and that's the real money. They put their shoulder down and did that, and I think it's fantastic. I think cities here in the province are smaller, maybe a little trickier, but certainly NB Housing could use that as one of the tools in their toolbox to try to preserve existing affordable. We talked about how much existing affordable is being lost. There's a way to preserve it. And if you add to that the new funding that's hopefully going to start to flow through this Canada Acquisition Fund, we may start to see that ratio start to change for the better.
So what else can municipal governments do?
So municipal governments, they have a lot of power. I think they realize how much power they have. They have power over police, and so the security of public spaces, and we're seeing more and more encampments, more people who are living in a form of absolute homelessness. They can take leadership as regards those issues. 25% of cities across the country have a protocol as regards encampments. And
25% of the cities across the country have a protocol regarding encampments.
correct. And Montreal is not one of them, by the way. We're really encouraging them to do something. And they've just announced the creation of a process to bring stakeholders together to try to develop such a protocol, amongst other things, including what services may be made available in encampments. It may be something we'd like to touch on more, but it's very interesting. But it's being led by the cities. The cities are doing that.
So what are the policies?
So the policies, there's a great range of what cities are doing. The City of London, Ontario, absolutely fascinating what they've decided to do. It's basically that they've said, all right, homeless encampments are happening. We can't stop them anymore. But what we can do is maybe try to ensure they're safe, and ensure they are limited in terms of their potential for conflict with residents in the city. So they've created what are called designated areas. So they've actually taken municipal land and they've said within this area, up to this many tents can be placed. Now they've done that and they've actually created additional designated areas because demand was quite high. So they also provide to those designated areas municipal services. So they do garbage pickup, they provide hot meals once a day and meals in the evening. Police go through and ensure there's no violence.
And you like the idea.
And so this is a model that is working for the City of London. It's not a model, for instance, that they're using in Edmonton. Edmonton also has encampments, but their policy is more around tolerance of those encampments that are, and that might have changed recently, by the way, because we saw some headlines, I think, last month about them clearing out the camps.
Right.
But prior to that, it was tolerance under certain conditions with an accent on trying to work directly with people in the camps to try to find them housing. So that was their orientation. So all to say, Tara, is that there's differences. Cities can go about doing this in different ways, but if we have a homelessness crisis, it's not just restricted to those people going to the shelters. It's people outside, and we need to acknowledge it and come together to try to develop a protocol, a policy that is appropriate for the community.
But is a well-managed area where people are living in tents, is that a solution?
The long-term solution to homelessness is not encampments. I profoundly believe that we can do way better than that. We talk about the right to housing. We haven't talked about that yet, but it's illusory right now. It doesn't exist, even though we've signed international treaties to that effect. Even though the federal government has enacted the National Housing Strategy Act, which speaks about the progressive right to housing, it doesn't exist today. Because if it did, we wouldn't see homelessness going up. We'd see it be going down.
Do you see government's efforts to this point as being well thought out, well managed, and effective? What is your assessment of what all three levels of government are doing? And I know we're talking a whole country, but use the Quebec example, or if you like the New Brunswick example. What is your assessment of how well governments have responded?
I think public policy in the area of homelessness is only about 20 years old. It's not that old, and it's changing all the time. As I say, the shape and size of homelessness has changed a lot. As I said, it's getting bigger, it's getting more distressing, and it's spreading out. So government policy, has to shift again. After having gone through, if you will, a first phase of policy with a focus largely on treatment, accompanying people out of homeless shelters and into housing. Now they have to change again. And I think it's going to take them some time to do it, and we have to give them some time to do it, but they have to think interministerially. This is not just about social development, and this is not just about health. If you're thinking, especially if you want to add prevention tools, you actually have to think about some of the other partners like public safety. as I mentioned before. So getting an interministerial group together and starting to really plan on trying to reduce the number of people coming in, more quickly help people getting out of homelessness, you're going to see the numbers change. And with the federal government's help in terms of the capital dollars to get your hands on doors and units, you could conceive of very muscular plans now. And I frankly think, Terry, and you mentioned this before, the public's expecting it now. It was kind of an issue in the past, but now it is one of the top 5 issues that we see in terms of public agendas. So I think the current administration, I think the administration in Quebec, they're seeing it in ways they've never seen before, and they know these will be electoral issues. They'll be held account to what they've done or not done. So I'm very positive about that too, and I think that'll be terrific to try to help to reverse the numbers.
You have worked within government, Deputy Minister of Social Development in Sean Graham's government. You know how policy goes from the seed to the full plant to the full policy. But who drives the innovativeness that's required to come up with new, untried, never before tried solutions? And how nimble is government once the idea begins in implementing that? What's the typical time frame? Is it years?
It's years. It's absolutely years. And good ideas can come from anywhere. And most people go into public office, the elected officials, for the right reasons. They want to make a difference. They want to have a legacy. Civil servants, quiet and in the background, are the quiet heroes of our social safety net and our public sphere and public services in general. And I don't say that about myself, honestly, because I wasn't a civil servant for very long. I was a civil servant not just under the Graham government, under the Allward government as well, just to set the record straight.
Yes, thank you.
But they are absolutely remarkable. Some of the smartest, some of the hardest working people that I've ever seen in my whole career are in the New Brunswick civil service, and I've seen others in other civil services as well who are absolutely remarkable. We should be so proud of them. We don't sing their praises enough, but political process is and bureaucracy is there for a reason. It's there to try to make sure the first decision you make is the right one. But when you're in a crisis, you got to do stuff. You got to take some risks. And I think we need to empower our politicians and officials to take more risks in a time when there's so much need. And when we're using the word crisis, we have to act like there's a crisis. If this was a forest fire, we'd be acting, but we've got a human crisis when it comes to homelessness. This is traumatic what these people are experiencing. And as I say, we have to license our leaders to be far more aggressive than they've been before in dealing with it.
So that brings to mind the idea that government has a responsibility to make people aware of the scope of the challenge, make people aware of what needs to be done to address the challenge, and also, in a stark way, say to the people, to the citizens, this is what happens if we do not address this. And by doing that, you get people on board, and then you create the social license to, okay, we're going to spend this pile of money on this, and we have your green light to go do that. So, do you see any evidence that government is making, at any level, making an attempt to bring people on board to change the social consciousness to one where that is a priority?
I don't think they're the only ones responsible for that. I do think leaders of civil society, people with lived experience, Indigenous leaders, we have other voices as well to signal to the population that something is going wrong. So governments absolutely have to do that, but what they are responsible for is actually doing something about it. You're right, they absolutely have to prepare the groundwork for it, but I think we're all responsible for putting up our hand and saying, this is not acceptable, and to do it publicly, and to write about it, and to do interviews about it, and to make sure the public is aware that it's not good enough, but we can do better. I mean, as I say, we wrote this book about this, and this is not the only roadmap. There's others. There's all kinds of other ideas out there that we need to take action on. But what we have to do absolutely, and not just regards homelessness and housing, but in general, make sure our public officials are aware that we're counting on them. They have been elected to lead, and leading is sometimes super hard. It's sometimes a terrible burden, but ultimately that's what you wanted. That's what you wanted, and this is one of those issues that you got to take on. And I actually think whether you're conservative, whether you're liberal, whether you're NDP, whether you're Green, you're there because you want to have your name associated with good things. Well, good homelessness policy backed by lots of money is going to get a lot of people on stage with you when you announce the policy. So go for it.
Okay, we have 1 minute left, and so I'm going to ask you, if you can, to describe what is the social effect of not doing something. Can you do that in 40 seconds?
We will see the trend continue. We will see more distress. The worst part about it is we know what to do. The worst part is that we have the knowledge. To know better is to do better. So let's get out there and do better, because otherwise we have only ourselves, and I'm looking mostly at public officials here. We have only ourselves to be responsible for. But can I say something hopeful? 700 people are going to be homeless tonight in the province, minimum. That's a really big high school.
Right.
It's not that big a deal when you, in the scheme of things. Can this province take that on, get those people housed, prevent other people from being housed? We absolutely can. So let's do it.
James Hughes, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for your energy and your ideas. The book is called Ending Homelessness in Canada, and I would like to thank the people here at Rogers for giving us this studio space to discuss this issue. Thanks so much for watching.